Hi, Kirkland here. I'm back and we're going to continue with Tome 10. We're going to go with part 3 of the logs here.
Arcus, 34. There are countless horror stories about mist or fog in the chamber, and not all of them are related to the entity. The unknowns have done an adequate job at separating the relevant from the irrelevant stories, making my research on what others have written about this place and experience easier to conduct. What is it about the fog, and not just black fog, that has inspired so many stories throughout the Omniverse? Chamber of Blood, 12 to midnight, dark age to come. The sound of a bottle clanging against the ground greeted Hattie as she entered the half-burned building that had gone up in flames nearly a week ago. Thick, smoky air stung her nose as she stepped over shards of glass and heaps of charred wood. Bright city lights spilled through the shattered windows and crumbling walls. Carefully, Hattie picked her way across the floor toward the elevator, where she found the door leading to the stairs. A sign on the door warned her that the entire structure would be demolished in the morning. There's still time, she thought, as she ascended the narrow stairs. I've got a few hours to convince Max that he's not crazy, that he's not losing his grip on reality, and that something is happening to our world, something only a few of us can see and feel. Hattie reached the last door at the top of the stairs and pushed her way onto the roof. There she spotted a man sitting on the ledge with thick, tangled hair and a weathered army jacket, drinking himself to oblivion as he stared out at the bright lights of the city. She approached him slowly, and he didn't react or even turn to regard her when she sat down beside him. She merely sat in silence, listening to the police sirens wail in the distance over the horns and the muffled music coming from the clubs and bars below. At last she said, "I thought I'd find you here." Max took a few swallows of rum. "I don't know you." "But I know you, Maxwell." "I don't care where you're from. I don't want to talk." "Yes, I can see that. You want to drink." "Perceptive," he said sarcastically, then extended the bottle toward her. "You're welcome to join." "No, thank you, Mr. Holt." "How do you know my name?" "I know much more about you, Max." "You CIA? FBI? "If I were, you'd already be dead," Hattie said. "You were an Olympic biathlon athlete. You were a soldier. Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. You left the military after an incident, and after that you kind of pulled yourself off the grid." "You know how to use a search engine. You get a gold medal. Now leave me alone to my quiet time." Max raised the bottle and took another swig. Hattie narrowed her eyes and looked to the shadows on the roof beyond him. She couldn't see anything, but she could hear disembodied voices talking to him. She shut them out, then leaned closer to him. "I know you see and hear things others can't. I know they follow you. I know you want them to stop, and I didn't get all that from a search engine." Max lowered the bottle from his lips and fixed his gaze on a couple arguing on the sidewalk below. "You don't know what I hear, what I see." "Things from another place, another world, another realm." Max swallowed a growing lump in his throat. Hattie paused, then continued. "Something otherworldly attacked your unit, and you survived because of your abilities, and now no one believes a word of it. You were ridiculed, discharged, and silenced with an endless supply of opioids to fog your memory and neutralize your questions." Hattie stopped as his eyes filled with tears. "You're not crazy, Max. You saw what you saw, and no drug or drink in the world will relieve the guilt or stop the nightmares. And that's why you're here, isn't it? Waiting for morning to make it all stop." Max cleared his throat. "What do you want?" "Your skills and abilities on my team. And what team is that? The one that is trying to stop the end of the world. Max laughed uproariously, then stopped at once. You're serious? Hattie grabbed the bottle out of his hands, took a swig, handed it back to him, and nodded gravely. Max shook his head. What do you know about what happened to my unit? Not much, Hattie admitted. What I do know is there are some very powerful people who have the answers, or think they have the answers you're looking for. What I do know is that since I was a teen, I've been caught in the crossfire between two warring groups that need people like us to access this other realm and bring things back. I've been running from them for the last 40 years, and I've helped others like us from suffering an unknown fate at their cruel hands. Max's face hardened. They laughed at me. They said something in me snapped, and that I had imagined the fog and the creatures that came out of it. Hattie shook her head. You didn't imagine anything. I lost my brother in the same way. They exchanged a look. He's not dead. I can still hear him. I do. But I can't see him. Where is he? Hattie shrugged. I don't know. All I know is we're not the only ones who lost friends and loved ones to this phenomenon. And if we work together, we might one day see them again. Max laughed and pulled on his bottle. So, you're recruiting me. Is that what you're doing? Recruiting me in some kind of paranormal army? He laughed again in disbelief. Hattie watched him laugh. I'm giving you what you need. And what is that? A second chance, Hattie answered flatly. Purpose, meaning, a chance to save others from being murdered or used by the same assholes who are coming for you right now as we speak. Max laughed. What are you talking about? Who's coming for me? I have a list. Hattie broke off abruptly. She pulled out a gun from her jacket and shot two dim figures in the head as they emerged from the exit door. She then jerked to her feet and hurried to the bodies, searching their jackets for IDs without any success. There'll be more, she said, looking up at Max as he stepped beside her with wide, confused eyes. You're at the top of their list, and that's why I'm here. What list? What are you talking about? Follow me, Hattie said, and I'll explain everything. Max nodded, dropped his bottle with a loud clang, and followed Hattie down the stairs, through the charred building, and out into the alley where a cab was waiting for them. Max Holt stood in the basement of the Park and Sherwood bookstore, examining a wall of pictures, notes, and numbers, covered by a web of red string highlighting connections. He narrowed his gaze on hundreds, if not thousands, of missing people from all over the world. Tacked between the pictures and notes were transcripts of horror stories from various podcasts, decoded into numbers and coordinates. He then glanced around the room and noticed artifacts and artworks from ancient civilizations he did not recognize from any history book he had ever read. And he had read many. He turned back to the wall and noticed for the first time a picture of his unit in Afghanistan, among countless other units that were missing in action. His face grew stern, his eyes narrowed, and he turned to Hattie and asked, "Is this the list?" Hattie stepped beside him. "This is the list of those we failed." Her eyes fixed on a picture of her brother at a World War II Zeppelin crash site in the French Alps, where they had recovered several wonder weapons that a secret unit of German soldiers was transporting for the Thule Society. It was the last time she had seen him before he had disappeared. The list is of those that are being targeted by some very powerful and disturbed elites. They will either be killed in ritual sacrifice, or they will be used as tools to search areas that overlap with another dimension. I don't understand. I know. It's a lot to take in. But these groups, they communicate through random podcasts and deliver encoded messages in stories and media, and we do our best to decode them. Max scoffed. Is this some kind of joke? Codes and stories? That's your list? Hattie shook her head. This is real. There are people who are in serious danger, and you can help them. You left the government because they laughed and ridiculed you. That won't happen with us. We know what you saw is real. Max approached the picture of his unit. I've got names and places and endless funds at my disposal, she said. We're 12 to midnight, and only a few of us know it. And I need you on our team, not theirs. Minutes? Seconds. 12 seconds. These groups, Max queried, are they that powerful? You have no idea. Max extended his hand, touching the picture of his unit. He then followed a red string to a passage culled from a horror story. From the passage, he followed yet another string to a series of numbers. The time, day, and place the creatures in the fog attacked them. Hattie stepped away and soon returned with a folder, pulling out a picture of an abandoned cemetery in Chile, along with a picture of a man. She handed the pictures to Max, and he stared at them for a long, thoughtful moment, before nodding that he would join her team. Chamber of Blood. Rabbits attack hiker in Colorado. A hiker is in critical condition after being bitten by a dozen rabbits that escaped the Ascendic Research Institute, an emergency responder said Friday. The hiker was bitten in the legs and face near Misty Lake, said National Park Ranger Steve Downer. The hiker's condition was unknown Friday, but doctors are optimistic. Chamber of Blood. The Red Crane. Veil of Blood. 1. Several paths led to the harbor where peasants and merchants had witnessed the strange appearance of a foreign ship. They discussed the ship and the arrival in the surrounding villages with mingled anger, fear, and curiosity. Most believed the foreigners were here to disseminate contraband and rob their beloved land of precious artifacts. Many believed a band of thieves was selling these precious goods to these foreigners in exchange for their weapons. Some even claimed that they had seen these thieves on the gangway, loading stolen artifacts and relics from fallen lords and noble families onto their ship. Saku Nakano stood in the moonlight, considering her options. There was the long and safe route along the dirt road, and there were shorter routes through the dark and deadly woods, where many unlucky villagers had been killed by creatures, it was said, not of this world. Saku knew of these cursed places all too well. She had lost her entire clan to these mist-enshrouded areas over the years, and now she roamed the country, the last of the Red Crown clan, seeking out the great corruption that was upon her people, finishing what her clan had started centuries ago. The enemies to her clan, the Black Serpent Society, served a 9-headed serpent made of black mist. They believed the Black Serpent would grant them powers and boons beyond human comprehension in this world and the next, in exchange for unquestioning devotion. They were convinced that the Black Mist Serpent was a demon that slithered through these wooded, cursed areas, creating doorways into what they called the belly of the serpent, or just the belly. Saku turned toward the dark woods, and sensing raw evil in her midst, she prepared to enter. Thinking about the hushed conversations she had overheard in the nearby markets, she remembered the merchant hacking and gutting fish as he talked to a woman who was going through a bag of oysters she had just gathered in the sea. She remembered them talking about how they had seen bandits with pistols and gunpowder, and other strange weapons. I remember them mentioning the foreigners, she thought. They said they were Dutchmen. They were on the wharf, speaking fluent Japanese with unknown merchants in plain kimonos, with the exception of a strange serpent crest. They described the crest as a 9-headed serpent, twisted in a circular knot as it chased its 9 tails. They described only a few sailors, and how most of the crew had perished of an unnamed disease during the voyage across the ocean. A sudden laugh interrupted her thoughts. "Where is your husband?" A man in a plain brown kimono looked her up and down in the pearly light of the moon as he approached her. Saku met his gaze, but did not react or respond. The man placed his hand lightly on the hilt of his sword as he continued to appraise her. She was tall and lean, with strong, sinuous arms and piercing dark eyes. She had long, black-oiled hair gathered in a perfect queue, doubled over and tied neatly with a red and white sash. She wore thong sandals and a simple black kimono. A vibrant red sash around her waist held 2 scabbard swords. One sword was short and straight. The other was long and curved at the tip. "Where are your papers?" The man edged closer to her with dim recognition in his eyes. He had heard rumors of an Onimusha in a black and red kimono roaming the land, destroying the wicked while protecting those who could not protect themselves. Or did she roam the land seeking justice for her butchered clan? Or was she a bandit leader who raided and pillaged villages? The man couldn't quite remember what he had heard, and he had forgotten the name people had given her. It was related to her clan and its origin. That much he knew, but not much more. It would have helped if he had paid closer attention when his wife had been discussing her many adventures with her sisters. But he had ignored most of the stories as exaggerated gossip and legends, not unlike that other samurai that everyone called a demon. There was no such thing as a demon samurai, and there was certainly no such thing as a woman samurai that could perform all the feats the stories claimed she had performed. Saku breathed deeply and placed her hand near the hilt of her long sword. "Do you not see I am addressing you? Where are your papers? Answer me, With impossible speed, Saku whirled her sword in a gleaming silver arc, and the man's torso toppled off his hips, and a fountain of warm crimson fed the ground. The twisted mouth twitched as it sputtered bile and blood and tried to make out the words, "Red Crane." He had remembered, a moment too late. Returning her sword to its scabbard, Saku sighed and said an inward prayer for the brute. Then she stepped over his jerking torso and entered the belly of the serpent. With careful, silent steps, Saku pushed smoothly through the belly, paying close attention to the lurking black mist slithering through gnarled trees that seemed to shift and waver with her every step, as though to intimidate her. "Don't make a sound," she thought, stepping down a slope through noiseless shadows toward the sound of waves crashing against rocks. She was close to the wharf. She could smell the seaweed, fish, and salt in the air. There was also something else, a strange heaviness in the atmosphere. Staring up through the shaking canopy, she saw thick clouds marching across the sky. She sensed the floor moving and looked down to see her legs completely submerged in the creeping mist. A moment later, a branch cracked not 10 paces away, and she knew she wasn't alone anymore. Saku neither ran nor hid. She froze, closed her eyes, listening carefully for threats approaching through the black mist that heaved and moved as though it were alive. Saku knew she was somehow, as difficult as it was to explain, in 2 worlds at once. And she knew there were demons and monsters in the other world that hunted within these overlapping areas. Saku didn't know much about this other world. What she knew, she had learned from her mother and father. The Black Serpent Society, they had once explained, believed the Black Mist Serpent was a living deity that consumed people, towns, civilizations, and worlds. The Black Serpent Society believed that within the belly there was lost knowledge and power from all these consumed worlds that could help them usher in a golden age of peace, prosperity, and abundance. Their dedication, their devotion, their ritualistic killings were, in the end, for the betterment of humanity. The Red Crown clan, however, believed the promise of a golden age was nothing more than a cosmic ruse, a shiny gold lure to snag minnows, fish, and whales in the abyss. With a deep breath, Saku sensed the threats were gone. She opened her eyes and continued through wavering light and shadow as the wind began to pick up and the mist grew thicker. But then she stopped suddenly when she heard a familiar roar. A thunderous roar that seemed to shake the world. This time, she didn't close her eyes. She didn't run. This time, she silently lowered herself by a tree as she heard the pounding footfalls of a giant samurai in shiny green and gold armor approaching. She heard him smashing bushes and trees with his kanabo as he searched for her in the shadows. She knew without seeing him that she was being hunted by the samurai that had been corrupted and turned into a demon by the Black Mist Serpent. Her sister had told her many tales about this samurai, how he had once been a man of honor and conviction, how he had hunted and executed corrupt merchants and false samurai, how peasants and villagers began calling him a demon because of his savage methods, and how he had ultimately been turned into the very thing he hated most, the very thing the stories depicted him as, the Oni samurai. The very same Oni her sister savagely battled long ago when they had been caught in the mist. She had escaped, her sister hadn't, and now all she wanted to do was take down this demon and make him tell her where she was. But Saku knew better than to lose herself in the past. She pushed the memory of her sister out of her thoughts and instantly found her focus. She looked through a gap in the trees toward the wharf, where she saw orange specks of light against the wall of darkness that was the sea. She could make it. She could outrun him to a place where he could not follow. Looking over her shoulder, Saku saw the giant samurai only 10 paces away. He was decked in shiny gold and green armor and carried around his back a massive leather bag dripping thick blood at the bottom. A few heads jutted out of the bag, and clouds of buzzing flies surrounded him. The Oni searched the trees and bramble and was now only 7 paces away. Unexpectedly, something jerked away from a bush, and he launched at the creature and smashed it with his kanabo, losing his bag in the attack. The bag fell, and dozens of heads rolled toward her. One head stopped at her feet and stared at her with wide-open eyes. Saku gasped as she suddenly realized she was staring at her own face. She fixed her gaze at the other heads in the mist and thought that they all seemed to resemble her, as though this demon samurai had already decapitated her countless times before. None of it made sense. Impossible, she thought. It cannot be, and yet it is. Have I fallen to the demon before? Are there others like me in the demon world that made him? But look, a scar. Saku observed the head at her feet and noticed a long scar on the side of her face. She instinctively felt her own cheek where the scar should have been. It was proof that this was someone else, though she could not deny the resemblance was uncanny. Saku swatted flies and reached for the head to get a closer look, but then she suddenly froze when she heard a terrifying roar not 5 paces behind her. In one fluid motion, she dove into a thicket as the kanabo missed its mark. Without a moment to spare, she scrambled to her feet and turned just in time to see a gore-covered kanabo with the crushed head of a rabbit coming down on her with devastating speed. Quickly, she sidestepped and withdrew her sword. An instant later, she slashed off the demon's arm with a roar of her own. But knowing the arm would grow back in the mist, she turned and charged away, desperately running for the beach. She had downed the demon before, but somehow it always managed to rise unscathed to continue the hunt. There was no defeating the demon. There was only one option: escape. As she rushed through the woods, she turned back to see the demon chasing after her. She pushed herself to run faster and faster. and just as the demon lunged at her again, she dove out of the mist through a break in the trees to a place he could not follow. The demon's samurai stopped suddenly and watched her closely. Saku clambered to her feet, brushing off sand, seaweed, and salt. She turned to face the edge of the woods where she saw red glowing eyes fade into the night. Then she heard the crunch of rocks behind her, followed by a clicking sound. She turned slowly to face the barrel of a musket pistol glinting in the moonlight. Chamber of Blood, the Red Crane, Veil of Blood 2. Saku looked beyond the pistol to a man in a dark kimono and short black hair. He inched closer to her with a smile, but she did not move nor give him the satisfaction of flinching. She met his gaze and edged back slightly. Then she stared off in the distance, where she could see shadows moving about a cluster of abandoned homes near the wharf. The small village had been abandoned, no doubt, due to its proximity to the woods and the creatures that lurked within the mist. The man cleared his throat and placed the barrel inches from her face. Saku stared into his eyes without fear or concern. She looked down at his sandals and back to his eyes. "Move," he ordered, his ignorant smile widening. "I know who." A sudden flash of moonlight, and his head toppled off his shoulders before he could finish his sentence. Saku watched the headless body spray warm blood into the cool night as it jerked left and right and finally collapsed into a mound of shells and seaweed, startling a nervous crab that instantly scuttled away into the gloom of the night. Saku gripped her sword and patiently picked her way through the jagged rock formations to reach the small village, where black serpent brutes guarded the area against anyone who might try to interfere with their dark rituals and secret trade negotiations. She moved silently through the shadows, following the edge of a home. She froze when she heard footsteps approaching. She slowly placed her back against the wall and waited. She peeked around the corner and saw two thugs telling stories about the demon samurai. She crouched slightly. Then, like a mighty tigress, she leaped into the air and thrust her sword through the two heads. They jerked violently, then collapsed when she pulled her sword from their skulls. She took a moment to survey the area, then made her way noiselessly to the wharf, where three thugs laughed and made jokes about the strange red alcohol the foreigners had shared with them. She held her sword firm, and she started toward them, practically gliding with quick, smooth steps. Just as one brute turned to meet her focused gaze, she lunged with blinding speed and... Three headless bodies suddenly staggered stupidly in the dark and collapsed into each other, with arterial blood spraying darkness against the bright light of the moon. Wiping warm blood off her face, she climbed a series of crates, moved past a clump of fishing nets, and crouched by the gangplank. She listened carefully for movement and heard steps just above in the ship. When the footsteps receded to silence, she moved stealthily up the gangplank and halted, scanning the ship, spotting one thug sitting cross-legged on a crate. Beside him were several other crates bearing the VOC logo and name of the Dutch East India Company. Carefully, Saku embarked on the ship and moved toward the brute. But just as she prepared to pounce, she heard a click, followed by a high-pitched wheeling sound. It took her less than a moment to understand she had been lured into a trap, less than a moment too late. Before Saku had time to react, she felt the heaviness of a net collapse over her as dozens of thugs surrounded her with dirty looks and curses. She then watched the sitting thug, the leader of the group, turn to face her. The leader smiled, stood briskly, and laughed. "We thought you might show up," he said as he approached her. He made a quick wave with his hand, and the thugs instantly trained musket pistols on her. "You've been quite busy interfering with our good work." She didn't respond, but she pushed and pulled against the net to gauge its strength. She glared at him as she realized this was no chance ambush. The Black Serpent Society had been tracking her and had somehow managed to trap her. The leader shook his head at her. Your clan is destroyed. Your weapon is irrelevant and outdated. You're outnumbered and trapped. And still you think you can do the impossible. This will be difficult, she thought, but not impossible. I've been in worse situations and survived. Saku inched closer to the leader as he smiled at her. She believed his reluctance to shoot her was evidence that they wanted her alive for one of their rituals. The leader motioned to all the thugs and laughed again. Saku gritted her teeth and studied the thugs as they slowly closed in on her from every direction. She looked into the leader's thieving dark eyes and saw all the lies and treachery of the Black Serpent Society. Then looking beyond his eyes, she visualized herself triumphing against her enemy, leaping from thug to thug, cutting them down with her sword like weeds. Suddenly the leader barked orders, snapping her back to reality. The thugs inched closer to her with hideous smiles and wide, nervous eyes. Surrender willingly, the leader said flatly, and we will reunite you with your clan, as misguided as they may have been. Saku understood his meaning. He believed their rituals would open a doorway into the nameless realm, where they were supposedly trapped and cursed to live out an endless cycle of life and death for reasons beyond comprehension. Saku didn't know what to believe. What she did know was that she wouldn't allow these thugs the satisfaction of serving her on a sacrificial platter to the darkness they served and she had promised to destroy. She had made an oath long ago as a member of the Red Crown clan to cleanse the world of the reeking corruption that was the Black Serpent Society, and she planned to honor that oath. With the strength and power of her ancestors coursing through her veins, Saku instantly rushed forward, her hand thrusting through the net. Powerful fingers grabbed the leader by the scruff of his kimono and pulled him in. Then, using him as a human shield, she whirled as pistols fired and balls ripped through his belly, chest, and skull. Through the rising smoke from the pistols, Saku could see the thugs trying to reload. Without a moment to lose, she tossed her busted and shredded shield to the ground, and with difficulty, she sliced through the net with her sword. A moment later, she was a hurricane of death and destruction, leaping from thug to thug as her hissing blade painted the deck red. The thugs didn't know what to do. They were too stunned to react. It was like fighting a ghost, a monstrous shadow, a formless mist with swords for claws. Their futile attempts to parry her attacks with pistols met empty air as limbs fell and heads rolled. It was a horrible nightmare, as if by some strange, ironic twist of fate, the Red Crane actually drew her power from the Black Mist Serpent, so that she was somehow a servant of the very darkness she had sworn to eliminate. When the last thug fell with a gasp, Saku found herself surrounded by blood and carnage. She took in the stench of gunpowder as her gaze slowly lowered to a thug, groveling like a maggot. She had sliced his legs at the knees, and he was crawling away with nervous elbows that slipped with every move in the growing pool of blood. Wiping the gore off her face and kimono, she blocked his path and crouched to face him. The thug looked at her with widening eyes. A bleat of terror rose from his throat that rose to a shrill pitch as she raised her sword and ended his service to the Black Serpent Society. Saku rose slowly and, searching the ship, spotted a cluster of oil lamps glowing and flickering atop a crate. With focused determination, she picked her way through the bodies and kicked the crate, sending the oil lamps scattering to the wooden deck below. The lamps spat liquid fire and set the deck and lifeboat ablaze. Then, walking away from the burning ship, Saku considered everything she had just experienced. Trapped. How did they know she was coming for them? How could she have taken the bait? How had she been lured so easily? Enough. Warriors do not waste time with what-ifs and what they should have or could have done. What matters now is the present and taking the next right step. Where to now? She couldn't think straight. Despite all her training, a flame of anger burst in Saku for her careless mistake. Yet she repressed her frustration and knew there was no use for it. Anger would only cloud her judgment and waste her time. She needed to keep her composure because her friends and family could not have perished in vain. Because she was the last of her clan. Because the Black Serpent Society had to be stopped. Because she was the hope of all those who believed she would end the darkness that was upon their land. Because she was the Red Crane. Arcus, 41. The mad designer sketches are preposterous, yet entertaining. I just went through hundreds of sketches of monsters and killers in tuxedos and golfing attire. It makes no sense. And yet I found myself pinning these absurd illustrations in my study. They have absolutely no value to my investigation, yet they made me smile, even laugh, and perhaps that's enough. Perhaps helping me forget the horrors of this place, even for just a moment, turns the absurdity of these designs into a kind of medicine. As much as I take offense to the complete disregard the mad designer has for these characters, I can't help but search the Chamber of Blood for more Emperor Dwight illustrations. They are, so far, my favorite. Arcus, 8542. The creatures move around the fog, watching me without attacking. They're waiting for the perfect moment, which will never come, for I have barricaded every door and window and practiced savage and efficient combat maneuvers with my 9-iron. I've caught glimpses of their forms, and they are ever-changing, as though imitating all the monsters I've read about in my favorite stories, as though the fog itself were an extension of my dark imagination and fears. I'm calling these horrible things creatures of the fog. Chamber of Blood, Deja Vuism. It was a book club, and they were arguing over the latest Edwin Cain novel, along with the interview the author had given, where he discussed a concept he had called Deja Vuism. He put forward the theory that our brains are biological quantum computers, with vast networking abilities beyond our current understanding of physics. Cain believed that our quantum brains could connect to other beings with similar frequencies within the multiverse, as though they were interdimensional cell phones. The club members, who discussed these theories and how they sometimes felt their inner voice was another version of themselves, advising them from another time or place, began telling stories about instincts, gut feelings, and deja vu experiences that felt all too real. There was one skeptic who scoffed at the idea of the multiverse. He thought the idea was ridiculous comic book nonsense, and he laughed at the very notion that our brains were interconnected multidimensional computers that received or projected ideas from the ether. One woman exclaimed, "It could be true. Such a theory would help us understand why ideas seem to come to us as a group, or why so many similar ideas seem to bubble up all over the world at pretty much the same time. Who's to say we aren't all tapping into the same stream of ideas?" The skeptic answered, "It's just coincidence. That's all it is when a bunch of people from different places come up with similar ideas. And coincidence has nothing to do with the multiverse or other versions of ourselves in the universe." Another man shook his head and said, "I don't really agree. There's shit out there we just don't understand. And I recently read the idea for Wi-Fi and cell phones came from a bunch of scientists trying to understand a gland in our brain. A gland that's bioluminescent and seems to be searching for signals. Granted, this could be online misinformation, but what is true, and what many cultures believe, is that our artists can tap into things not of this world. What I found interesting was how Cain said these visions that artists receive are only accessible to those who experience trauma when they're young, those who have been bullied, abused, exiled, those who have learned to shut out their reality for self-protection in order to fully experience other realities. A woman added, "The door to the physical world closes, the door to another world opens." The skeptic laughed and was just about to speak when another woman, an aspiring storyteller, interrupted him and said, "I get visions and dreams about the same place all the time. One of my recurring dreams is of Romulus and how he is taken up by a massive black storm cloud and brought to this dark realm where he's chased by a hideous creature, a monster that could not possibly exist. What's strange is he's not alone. He's not the only being hunted. He's with a biker and 2 other Scottish men who at first I thought were sailors. But then I had this other dream that showed me that they were, in fact, lighthouse keepers. I did some research and I could swear by the pictures that the biker I was seeing was Yui Kimura, the one who disappeared a few years ago." The skeptic laughed and said, "So what you're saying is the Emperor of Rome wasn't assassinated by his generals, but is somehow stuck in some kind of demented world with Yuri Kimura and 2 lighthouse keepers. This, you somehow believe, is real. Romulus and Yui are running from a monster as we sip coffee and tea in our cozy chairs and talk books and authors. This is what you're putting forward as something possible? Something reasonable for all of us to believe?" A woman said, "It sounds a bit out there, but maybe there are things in the cosmos that are beyond reason or science." Another woman beamed at the aspiring storyteller and said, "Real or not, you should write a story for your blog or even for your next performance. I think it would be a lot of fun, even if it does require a little suspension of disbelief." The aspiring storyteller smiled and answered, "Actually, I have a draft I've been working on, which I wanted to share with the group before I posted it. I'm still not sure if it's a story I can perform because it's a bit complicated and messy, but maybe you can help me find ways to energize and simplify it." Everyone nodded enthusiastically, except for the skeptic who rolled his eyes. The storyteller pulled out a coffee-stained notebook and opened it to a story that she still hadn't titled. She took a deep, calming breath and began. "This story doesn't have a title, but I'm thinking of calling it The Tragedy of Cliff and Alex, who were real people and who disappeared before most of us were born. Now, I'm not one to believe in conspiracy theories or urban legends, but their story, which I acquired through extensive interviews and research, opened my mind to the possibility that there is more to our lives than that which can be seen or proven." The skeptic quipped, "Well, that's convenient, isn't it?" The storyteller ignored his comment and continued. "Love, for example, exists and ceases to exist just as soon as we indulge in proofs and evidence. As soon as there is doubt, as soon as there is a need for proof, love is dead. And yet we know love is real. And we know, don't we, that love is quite unreasonable. It's powerful, it's maddening, and we hate that we can't define it. Love exists, and it doesn't need to be proven in any way, shape, or form for it to be real." The storyteller made an exaggerated gesture to grab something in the empty air. And yet, just as soon as you try to grasp it, it tatters at the touch. Cliff Barra always loved horror movies. He started making scary movies when his father bought him his first Super 8 camera. And so it comes to no surprise that he grew up to be a famous director who translated his favorite Gothic novels and horror stories to the silver screen. It's also no surprise that when he met Alex DeMauro, an equally famous art director known for his brilliant and visionary production sets and costume designs, that they were instantly smitten with one another. Together, it's safe to say, they produced some of the scariest and most iconic films to date. But all this changed when Alex suddenly disappeared while on set. In a rolling cloud of black fog the crew insisted they had not designed. From that point on, the movie stopped. A great heaviness came over Cliff as he found himself confronted by the horror that he would never see Alex again. He turned his back on his friends, his career, his life, and he became possessed by an obsession to find out what had happened to Alex. Investigations into this strange fog led him to a group of people searching for missing loved ones. With this group, he learned about the existence of secret cults and societies that understood the black fog and the strange realm from which it came. He dug deeper and deeper, discovering his old movie set wasn't haunted as everyone said it was, but was a kind of doorway to another realm. So he returned to the haunted movie set where Alex disappeared and waited and waited. He waited for days until finally he heard Alex's laughter, and with the laughter came the fog, and the fog rolled in and carried him away. And so Cliff ended up in another world that defied his wildest nightmares. He followed Alex's voice through a darkness that had never known the light of day. At last, he came upon a forest of wooden stakes bearing skewered heads. He picked his way through the stakes, inspecting each head. The scene reminded him of one of the first films he had made as a teenager. He soon came to one head that resembled an old producer friend of his. Suddenly, the eyes sprang open, and Cliff started. At once, all the heads came alive, taunting and ridiculing him like he had been ridiculed as a child for his passions and hobbies. But Cliff stayed the course, despite the insults and the taunts, that he would never see Alex again. One head of the thousands shouted louder than the rest. The head screamed that Alex was being corrupted and that he should turn back before it was too late. Realizing this severed head knew more than the rest, Cliff kicked the stake and caught the head as it toppled off. The head protested and yelled that it had once been a king, and it didn't want to be in the hands of a commoner. And Cliff promised the king he would release him after, and only after, he helped him find Alex. Long story short, the head led Cliff to the edge of a massive gate that surrounded a town that resembled every production set Alex had ever designed for Cliff. Before he could take in the area, he suddenly heard Alex screaming in the distance. The king warned Cliff not to interfere with the process, and explained that Alex was being twisted and tortured into a brutal, murdering monster for reasons they would never understand. But Cliff couldn't bear to hear Alex suffer. Every agonizing scream was a dagger in his heart, and so, dropping the head, he climbed over the gate and, unperturbed by the formless creatures moving in the fog, he followed the cries to the top of the castle he recognized from his Frankenstein film. Cliff charged up the winding stairs to the roof, where he found Alex, agonizing on a metal table as bolts of lightning struck him every few moments from a thick, black storm cloud. All around him in glass prisons, filled with formaldehyde, were all the monsters Alex had ever designed since he was a child. Cliff couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was as if this living nightmare were all a projection of their combined memories. Cliff didn't even try to understand what was happening or what he was experiencing. Without hesitation, he rushed up to Alex, not knowing what to do. In the shadows, he spotted an axe on the cobblestone floor and instantly grabbed it. Then, despite the deadly lightning, he pushed through the sizzling and sparking pain to smash the chains that bound Alex to the table. Alex opened his half-conscious eyes with difficulty. He barely recognized Cliff. Alex squinted with charred eyelids and managed to murmur words that made Cliff smile. Then Cliff hefted Alex over his shoulders and charged down the stairs and out into the thickening fog, where frantic, formless creatures did all they could to prevent them from escaping. Cliff kicked, punched, and charged through the fog, smashing through creatures, crows, and claws, everything and anything the world set against him. He remembered the king telling him something about a hatch. The hatch would somehow lead to freedom. Desperately, Cliff searched the ground as he heard a roar followed by a clap of thunder. Pounding steps chased him through the darkness. He didn't even bother to look back. He rushed forward until he saw it, the glint of metal by a crumbling gargoyle statue from one of his movies. He ran to the hatch, opened it, and lowered Alex to safety. Then, just as he was about to descend, Something sharp like talons clutched his ankles and pulled him screaming into the raging fog. I'd like to say that it all worked out in the end, and that they lived happily ever after. But that's not the truth of this story. The truth is, Cliff took Alex's place at the torturer's table, and was turned into a perfect champion of horror with little or no memory of who he was, or how he ended up in this dark realm. And Alex, well, he ended up with a group of stranded souls who did whatever they could just to survive. But that's another story for another time. Suffice to say that love torments all, bringing the best and worst out of us when we least expect it. The storyteller finished, and everyone was silent and inward, thinking about what they had sacrificed for love, and what they would sacrifice for love. But not the skeptic. No, the skeptic was turning the story over and over in his head, searching for issues. At last he broke the silence, asking, "What happened to the head? The talking head? Cliff just drops the king's head and then you never hear about it again. It kinda makes the story incomplete." A woman blurted out, "Who cares about the damn head? It's a love story." The skeptic added, "Also, I don't think you can use tatters as a verb." The storyteller smiled and politely said, "I'm still working the story, and the ideas are still coming to me in my dreams. I've been logging them in my notebooks, and I'll reread the current version more critically to see if I need to do something else with the talking head." Another woman said, "All that horror, and for what? To end up twisted and tortured and turned into some abomination, worse than anything he ever filmed? I feel so bad for him." A man said, "I don't. Not because I don't like him as a character, but because that's just the kind of things we do for love. The horrible and the beautiful. The bitter and the sweet. The euphoria and the madness." He lost himself in a memory for a moment. "Love twists and torments. And I'm sure there's nothing that dark world can do to anyone that would surpass the torment of not knowing what had happened to a loved one. Or worse, the regret of knowing what had happened and not doing anything." Another man said, "Well, I do hope you publish this story on your blog. I found it heartbreaking and terrifying. And I guess I'm wondering if you really think this is what happened to the real Cliff and Alex." The storyteller shrugged and closed her notebook as she prepared to leave. She wasn't sure what she believed anymore. The skeptic laughed and said, "I'll tell you what I think. I think the real Cliff and Alex faked their disappearance to get out of the limelight, and they moved far, far away to some gorgeous exotic island where they're eating grapes, drinking margaritas, and living happily ever after." The man said, "Well, I do hope you're right, and the story is just a story. But if you're not, well, I hope Alex will one day be able to do for Cliff what Cliff did for him." A woman said, "It kinda makes you wonder if the characters we read about in the books are actually real somewhere." Another woman said, "A story in this world, reality in another." The storyteller stood, smiled at all the book club members, and excused herself as she had an early shift at the cafe. Everyone said goodbye, watched her disappear out the door, and then returned to their discussion about Edwin Kane, déjà vuism, and the story they had just heard.
Alright, you guys, well that concludes Tome number 10, Saw, and we'll catch you on the next one, Tome 11. Until then, this is Kirkland signing out. Have a good night, everyone. Bye for now.